They called it the song that made them untouchable. And in the autumn of 1976, it was everywhere. Slow dances, car radios, wedding receptions, late-night drives down empty highways. The world heard a band at the absolute peak of its power. But inside the group, something was already dying. One ballad changed Chicago forever. And the men who built the band from nothing were powerless to stop it. This is the song that made Chicago legends but sparked a civil war. It started in the winter of 1967 in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago, Illinois, where a group of young musicians shared a vision so radical that the industry laughed them out of boardrooms. They wanted to build a rock and roll band with a horn section at its absolute center, not as decoration, not as an accent, but as the beating heart of the sound itself. They called themselves The Big Thing, then Chicago Transit Authority, and finally, simply Chicago. And from the very beginning, they operated by a code that set them apart from every other act in the country. No single frontman, no star above the others, just 7 equals sharing the spotlight and the microphone. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The lineup that emerged from those early sessions was something the music world had never quite seen. Guitarist Terry Kath brought a raw, ferocious energy that left audiences stunned. Jimi Hendrix himself, after watching Kath play, reportedly told him he was a better guitarist than Hendrix was himself. Keyboardist and primary songwriter Robert Lamb gave the band its intellectual compass, penning complex, politically charged anthems that demanded something from the listener. Trombone player James Pankow anchored the brass section alongside trumpeter Lee Loughnane and woodwind player Walter Parazider, creating a horn arrangement so melodic it functioned as a fourth vocalist trading lines with the singers. Bass player Peter Cetera and drummer Danny Serafine held the low end with precision and power. Together, they were the sum of something greater than any individual piece. Their early years were built on refusal. When a prominent executive heard their demo and offered to sign them on one condition, that they get rid of the horn, the band's response was immediate and unequivocal. Pankow later compared that demand to telling Elton John to stop playing piano. The label walked. Chicago stayed exactly who they were, and that stubbornness paid off. Their debut double album in 1969 announced them to the world as something genuinely new. Jazz fusion complexity wrapped in hard rock voltage, with 3 distinct lead vocalists trading lines across ambitious, multi-part compositions. The album reached the top 20 on the national charts. The follow-up climbed to number 4. By the mid-1970s, they had scored a string of #1 albums. They were the biggest band in America that critics couldn't quite figure out, beloved by millions and respected by peers. A democracy of 7, humming with creative tension and forward momentum. For a few brilliant years, the machine ran perfectly. By the spring of 1976, the band gathered at an isolated recording studio nestled high in the Colorado Rockies, a remote mountain facility that had become their preferred creative refuge. They arrived worn down, still recovering from the exhaustion of a relentless touring schedule and the emotional fallout of their previous album. The sessions for what would become their 10th studio record began without a clear direction, the members uncertain about which version of themselves they wanted to present to the world. It was during these sessions Peter Cetera arrived with a quiet, acoustic-driven ballad he had written on guitar. The song was delicate, melodic, emotionally vulnerable, and it landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Several of the band's members heard it and felt an immediate unease. This wasn't Chicago. There were no horn lines trading counter melodies with the vocal. There was no rhythmic aggression, no political edge, no jazz-inflected complexity. This was a soft pop love song, and some members weren't sure it belonged on their record at all. Their producer and manager, James William Guercio, heard something entirely different. He recognized the track's commercial potential immediately and moved forward with a recording plan that would, in retrospect, symbolize everything that was about to go wrong. When it came time to track the acoustic guitar part for the recording, Guercio sat down with the instrument himself, intending it as a temporary placeholder for Terry Kath to replace at a later session. But Kath never played the part. The band listened to what Guercio had recorded and decided it was sufficient. Their legendary guitarist, the man Jimi Hendrix had called his equal, was not on the band's biggest hit. The situation with the horns was equally revealing. To give the ballad a lush, orchestral lift, Guercio brought in a string arranger who layered the track with sweeping strings and soaring French horns. But those French horns were not played by Parasitor, Pankow, or Loc Name. They were performed by outside classical session musicians, professionals hired specifically for this recording. The actual horn players of Chicago, the men who had defined the band's identity for nearly a decade, had no role on the song. The track that would make Chicago household names around the world was, in the most meaningful sense, not a Chicago recording at all. The album arrived in record stores in June 1976, and its first single, Robert Lamb's Another Rainy Day in New York City, quietly stalled at number 32 on the national chart. It was a respectable showing for most bands, but for Chicago, accustomed to the top of the charts, it felt like a warning signal. Then, in late July, the second single was released to radio. Within weeks, If You Leave Me Now was everywhere. By mid-autumn, it had climbed to number 1 in the United States, where it stayed for 2 consecutive weeks. It hit the top in the United Kingdom, where it held for 3 weeks. It topped the charts in Canada, Australia, Ireland, and the Netherlands. In New York City, listeners reported being able to tune across 4 different radio stations of entirely different formats and hear the same song playing simultaneously. By the following summer, the track had moved over 1.5 million copies in the United States alone, and carried home 2 Grammy Awards, including Best Pop Vocal Performance and Best Arrangement. The victory was intoxicating, and for some members of the band, it was immediately terrifying. Robert Lamb, who had been the band's most prolific songwriter since their earliest days, later reflected that the song's success caught them completely off guard and fundamentally altered how the outside world perceived Chicago. Woodwind player Walter Parasitor captured the dissonance of the moment perfectly. He had been lounging by his pool one afternoon when the radio turned on in the background, playing a beautiful, lush ballad with acoustic guitar and soaring strings. He stopped and thought to himself that it sounded like Paul McCartney. It took several long seconds before the realization landed. That was his own band. The executives and radio programmers did not share Parasitor's unease. They held a number 1 record, 2 Grammy trophies, and what they believed was the clearest possible roadmap for Chicago's future. The band that had spent 8 years proving a rock group could carry horns had just proved something the industry found far more useful, that Peter Cetera's voice over orchestral strings sold millions of records. The democratic experiment was over. The machine had a new direction. What followed the song's success was not a sudden takeover, but a slow, grinding erosion, the kind that leaves a wound before anyone notices the bleeding. The horn players, who had spent their careers as the melodic centerpiece of Chicago's sound, found their role quietly diminished album by album. In the classic era, the brass had operated as a melodic voice, trading lead lines with the singers, driving arrangements forward with the same authority as any guitar. After the ballad changed everything, that approach disappeared. The horns moved to the background, relegated to simple harmonic accents and brief fills, the musical equivalent of a boxer being asked to carry bags. The frustration behind the scenes was palpable. The follow-up ballad arrived in 1977 with Cetera's Baby, What a Big Surprise, another soft, orchestrated pop song that reached number 4 on the national chart, handing the label exactly the confirmation they were looking for. For every note it climbed, the original identity of Chicago sank a little further. One member of the band went on record during this period, complaining openly that the horn section was being recorded so poorly and used so timidly that it sounded like kazoos. The men who had once been the band's defining voice were now watching from the edge of their own recordings. Terry Kath, whose ferocious guitar playing had always served as the counterweight to the band's more delicate tendencies, made no secret of how he felt. Associates and inner circle figures from the period confirmed that Kath's hatred of If You Leave Me Now was intense and vocal. He viewed the ballad direction as a betrayal of everything they had built, a surrender to commercial pressure that dishonored the band's original purpose. For a man who had devoted his life to the raw, uncompromising power of their early sound, watching that sound be packaged and softened for mass consumption was unbearable. The horn section sought relief by performing elsewhere. During this period, Chicago's brass players appeared as guest musicians on a major recording by another well-known act, channeling the melodic energy their own band no longer seemed to need. They were still masters of their craft. Their own group had simply stopped asking them to prove it. Now it doesn't matter. On the evening of January 23rd, 1978. Terry Kath was at a party at the home of a roadie in the San Fernando Valley when he picked up an unloaded semi-automatic pistol, placed it against his head in what he apparently believed was a harmless gesture, and pulled the trigger. There was one bullet left in the chamber. Kath was 31 years old. The band was shattered, not merely grieving the loss of their friend and musical brother, but reeling from the sudden removal of the one voice most clearly still tethered to Chicago's original soul. Drummer Danny Seraphine, who had played alongside Kath since they were teenagers on the streets of Chicago, later recalled the devastation of seeing his childhood friend's boots sticking out from a body bag that was too short for his tall frame. It was an image that never left him. Kath's death did not just take a guitarist. It removed the internal resistance that had slowed the band's drift toward pure commercialism. With Kath gone, there was no longer anyone willing to fight from inside the studio for the rough-edge rock identity that had made them legendary. Robert Lamb, the band's other great anchor of creative authenticity, began a long and painful struggle with substance abuse in the years that followed, pulling him further from his role as the band's primary songwriter and leaving a creative vacuum that the industry was more than willing to fill. By the early 1980s, the consequences of a decade's worth of drift had arrived. The band found themselves dropped by their label after a string of increasingly poor-selling records. Years of commercial compromise had not only cost them their artistic credibility, it had cost them their commercial standing as well. They had drifted so far from what made them special that they had stopped being reliable in any direction. A band that had once sold out stadiums was struggling. The democratic dream that had brought 7 young men together in Chicago was barely recognizable. In 1982, searching for a lifeline in a music landscape now dominated by synthesizers and image management, Chicago signed with a new label and brought in a producer named David Foster. Foster was brilliant, relentless, and completely uninterested in preserving what remained of Chicago's original identity. His vision for the band was explicit and total: lush, polished, ballad-driven, adult contemporary pop. The brass section, to the extent it appeared at all, would exist purely as decoration. The resulting album arrived that year, and its centerpiece single, Hard to Say I'm Sorry, co-written by Peter Cetera and Foster, climbed to #1 on the national chart. Chicago had their second chart topper. The strategy worked, but the price of that revival required a quiet act of institutional surrender that Pankow, Parasiter, Loch Nane, and the others would spend years processing. Foster co-wrote the majority of the album's tracks, performed most of the keyboards and synthesizer bass himself, and brought in outside session musicians to handle the guitar parts. The horn players, when they appeared at all, were playing harmonic accents over a bed of synthesizers. The cruelest symbol of this era came in the band's music videos, now essential currency in the television age. There, the legendary horn players of Chicago, men who had built their careers on live performance and melodic improvisation, were filmed pretending to play keyboards for the camera. The visual language of their own success had turned them into props. When the horn section protested their exclusion from the core tracking sessions, management responded with a bluntness that left no room for debate. Radio stations had sent explicit word that they did not want anything with horns on it. The instrument that had defined the band was now a liability in the marketplace they had helped create. The commercial formula proved devastatingly effective in the short term. Their 1984 album became the best-selling record in the band's history, moving over 6 million copies in the United States and producing 4 top 20 singles. Chicago had been revived as a commercial force, but the version of the band that existed inside those platinum certifications bore almost no resemblance to the 7-piece brass rock collective that had launched nearly 2 decades earlier. For Peter Cetera, the success confirmed what the years since 1976 had been quietly building toward. He was Chicago to the mainstream public. His voice on those ballads was the product people were buying. The band's elaborate democratic structure, the one they had fought so hard to preserve in those early years, now felt like a cage. In 1985, Cetera officially announced his departure from the group. He immediately stepped into a solo career that validated every calculation. His first major solo single reached #1 on the national chart. His second #1 followed not long after. The world that had fallen in love with his voice through the band's ballads was more than willing to follow him. He had, in the truest sense, outgrown the institution that made him famous. The remaining members carried on, replacing Citera with a new vocalist and continuing to tour behind the catalog. But the fractures were not finished. In 1990, drummer Danny Serafine, a founding member since the band's earliest days, a man who had given his youth and his identity to the project, was voted out by his remaining childhood bandmates. In his memoir, he described the experience with unflinching honesty, acknowledging that the business had finally swallowed the brotherhood whole. The men who had once stood in a circle refusing to let an executive take their horns had, in the end, taken something far more personal from one of their own. Decades later, If You Leave Me Now endured in a way that the band's fractures never did. It found its way onto streaming playlists and classic radio rotations, and the soundtracks of romances that had nothing to do with the internal conflicts that produced it. The song outlived the democracy that made Chicago, the friendships it cost, and the artistic identity it quietly dismantled. That was the specific nature of its legacy. Not triumph uncomplicated, but triumph inseparable from loss. In 2016, the original lineup of Chicago was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition that arrived with the particular bittersweet quality of honors that come long after the wounds are set. Music writers who covered the induction acknowledged the ballad's complicated status directly, one noting that despite the damage it had caused, the vocal performance at the song's center remained the finest single vocal moment in the band's entire catalog. It was the kind of assessment that contained its own quiet devastation, and yet the song played on. It played as the comfortable background of nostalgia, stripped of all the trouble it caused. That was the particular cruelty and the particular beauty of a song that became larger than the people who made it. What listeners heard when they put on If You Leave Me Now was a perfect pop record. What they could not hear was everything it cost. They could not hear Terry Kath's guitar because he was never asked to play it. They could not hear the horn section's melodic voice because session musicians had taken that place. They could not hear the democracy of 7 equal musicians because by the time the track was finished, that democracy was already ending. Chicago gave the world a song about the fear of losing something irreplaceable, and in doing so, they lost something irreplaceable themselves. Chicago proved that the greatest ambitions carry the greatest risks. They built a brass rock democracy that refused every compromise and earned every stage they played. Then one ballad changed everything, and the machine that replaced it could sell millions, but could never replace what was lost. For those who remember the early records, the memory of what Chicago once was endures alongside the music they left behind. Drop your Chicago memory in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from rock's greatest era.